Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 718 for August 5th, 2018. Coming up in a few minutes.
We want to leave the brand in better shape than we found it. So I think that's the mission that I've set out on. And I know having an assistant master distiller in Chris Fletcher, whose grandfather was a distiller before him, he said, if the whiskey quality starts to drop, Grandpa's going to let me know about it. So the people before us are watching, and the people that will come are counting on us.
Jeff Arnett is celebrating his 10th year as the Master Distiller for Jack Daniel's. This week he unveiled a new bottled-in-bond edition of Jack Daniel's for the travel retail market at an event in New York City. We sat down to talk about his first 10 years, and our conversation is coming up later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. We'll also have the calendar of events, your voice, the What I'm Tasting This Week department, and go behind the label, too. It's all coming up on the weekend edition of WhiskyCast.
This is whiskey, Johnnie Walker's Scotch whiskey, from this place and these people, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnnie Walker Black Label. Step right up.
WhiskyCast, brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot-still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
Let's start with the news. It's brought to you by Highland Park. We'll start off in Ireland, where Bushmills is hoping to get planning approval later this month for part of its $36 million distillery expansion project in Northern Ireland's County Antrim. That project is receiving opposition from local community groups on environmental grounds. It would include 29 new maturation warehouses on a site near the distillery, about a mile outside the village of Bushmills. But the Belfast Telegraph reports opposition centers on the impact of storing so-called hazardous substances on the site, along with hurting the village's designation as, quote, an area of outstanding natural beauty. The group Save Our Causeway Coast claims Bushmills already has enough storage for maturing barrels. It should be noted that the planning application calls for those 29 new warehouses to be built as needed over the next 22 years. Local business leaders have endorsed the expansion, and the Causeway Coast and Glens Council is expected to consider the Bushmills application at a hearing August 22nd. Last week, Bushmills filed a separate application for final approval on its expansion plan for the distillery site itself. Local councils in Ireland have already rejected 2 other projects for new maturation warehouses so far this year. Whiskey industry leaders in Ireland say a shortage of warehouse space could keep distilleries from making the most of the global boom in Irish whiskey sales. Meanwhile, there's a new Bushmills bottling available only at the distillery's Visitors Center. It's a 2008 single malt matured in a combination of bourbon and sherry casks, then finished in barrels made from acacia wood. It's bottled at 47% ABV and sells for €74. That's around $86 a bottle. Sticking with Irish whiskey for a minute, Dublin's Pierce Lyons Distillery has released its first new whiskey since the death of its founder, Dr. Pierce Lyons, earlier this year. It's a 5-year-old single malt distilled back when the stills, now in the former St. James's Church, had been set up temporarily at the Carlow Brewing Company while renovation of the church was underway. Only 4,000 bottles will be available. They'll sell for around €80 a bottle at Ireland's Super Value stores and will also be available at select bars in Ireland. And Teeling Whiskey is kicking off a new travel retail expression that will only be available at the Irish Whiskey Collection shops in the Dublin and Cork airports. That's because the Collinstown Collection has a unique connection to the Dublin airport. It was originally known as Collinstown Airport when it opened back in 1940. The whiskey is a 12-year-old blend finished in ex-Lupiac wine casks from France. It also celebrates the reworking of the Loop retail area inside Terminal 2 at Dublin Airport. The price will be €65. That's around $75 duty-free for travelers leaving the European Union. It'll be a higher price, €80. That's around $92.50 US, with duty for travelers flying within the EU. Douglas Lang & Company is releasing its second batch of Rock Oyster cask strength. It's the Islands whiskey in the company's remarkable regional malts range and was matured exclusively in American oak casks before being bottled at 56.1% ABV. 8,400 bottles will be available at whiskey shops with a recommended retail price of around £50, about $65 a bottle. Meanwhile, Heaven Hill is about to release the fall 2018 edition of its Old Fitzgerald Bottled in Bond bourbon. It's being bottled this month from barrels filled back in October of 2008, and it's the second release in the Old Fitz Bottled in Bond series that began this spring. It'll be available soon for about $90 a bottle. Purists may cringe at the thought of so-called celebrity whiskeys, but let's face it, they sell. Earlier this year, Wild Turkey unveiled Long Branch, a collaboration between Wild Turkey Master Distiller Eddie Russell and the brand's creative director, actor Matthew McConaughey. When I talked with Eddie recently, he admitted that Long Branch sales have beaten all expectations.
I really thought it was a great juice, looking for a new consumer, but it surprised me how many people that like the 101s and rare breeds have contacted me and said it's a really good, solid juice. So we had to rush some production because we thought we'd only sell about 7,500 cases and wound up about 20 already. And we haven't really even kicked it off in Australia yet. So it's about a 2-day process doing the American oak and the mesquite oak and then letting them marry together. So it's a little harder than we really needed to make it probably.
Can you keep up with the demand for it?
Right now, yes. I mean, if it gets to a couple 100,000 cases in 4 or 5 years, then I got to start making some decisions.
Does the credit go to you or to McConaughey?
I made it all and blended it all. He just tasted it. But he really loves it, so I'll give him credit too.
You'll find my tasting notes for Wild Turkey's Long Branch at whiskeycast.com. And another musically inspired bourbon is hitting the market. Longtime musician and producer Neil Giraldo is behind the 3-chord blended bourbon that's hitting shelves in Michigan, New York, New Jersey, and California. The whiskey is sourced from several distilleries in Kentucky and Tennessee, then blended in Michigan, and hit with tonal vibrations said to change the character of the spirit. Giraldo says he got the idea from watching drinks vibrate while sitting on his guitar amplifiers. Of course, this is not the first time music and sound have been used in the maturation process. Tuttletown Distillery founders Ralph Lorenzo and Brian Lee started using subwoofers with low-frequency tones in the rickhouse at their upstate New York distillery years ago. After the 2012 fire that damaged the distillery, they switched over to mounting speakers on the outside of the tin roofs of their rickhouses that minimized the spark hazards from wiring, while turning the entire roof of the rickhouse into a giant subwoofer. It beats talking to the barrels. Who wants to hear distillers walking through a rickhouse all day long going, "Mature faster, damn it!" You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskeycast.com. The news is brought to you by Highland Park, the Orkney single malt with Viking Soul. Look for the complete range of Highland Park whiskeys at a whiskey shop near you, including the longtime classic Highland Park 18-year-old. You can find out more at highlandparkwhiskey.com. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. The Beer, Bourbon, and Barbecue Festival is this coming Saturday, August 11th in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Tasmanian Whiskey Week has distillery events all over the Australian state and runs from August 13th through the 19th. The Whiskey Affair is August 18th at Haslemere Hall in Haslemere, England, and the Whiskey Social is that same day in Falkirk, Scotland. There's a whiskey tasting August 22nd at the White Oak Tavern in Ellicott City, Maryland, to benefit victims of the recent flooding there. Whiskey Live is August 24th and 25th in Adelaide, Australia. The San Diego Spirits Festival is August 25th and 26th in San Diego, California. And cocktail guru Jim Meehan will be leading a cocktail camp at Cardinal Spirits in Bloomington, Indiana, August 27th and 28th. Right now, we have 186 different events on our searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. Just click on that search button to find a whiskey tasting or festival near you.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Lagavulin. 10 years ago, Jeff Arnett was named the 8th Master Distiller for Jack Daniel's, the latest in a long line that dates back to Jack Daniel himself and Nearest Green, all the way back in 1866. It's been a busy decade for Jeff, who's introduced more new whiskeys than all of his predecessors combined, including a range of rye whiskeys. Wednesday night, he was at New York City's historic France's Tavern with the latest release, a bottled in bond Tennessee whiskey that will be exclusive to the travel retail market for now. And that's where we started our conversation.
So let's talk first of all about the bottled in bond. This is something that used to be the standard for Jack Daniel's, right? It pretty much almost always used to be essentially a bottled in bond, right?
Well, from the earliest of times, Jack Daniel, of course, sold his whiskey in barrels. Ahead of this Bottled in Bond Act that came out in 1897, Jack Daniel's had made a decision to get into the iconic square glass bottle, so that was introduced in 1895, just a couple of years before this law was written. Our lead proof back in those days was 90 proof. That's, a very historical proof for us. But I think what Jack understood was that there was a lot of things happening to the whiskey barrels after they left his hands. They would, send them out into the trade, and if the whiskey began to run low, people would backfill it with water or other things to kind of extend the whiskey. And so people weren't getting a pure representation of what he was making. So by going into a bottle, Jack recognized that he could basically put his label on it, guarantee the proof, put a seal on it that would be guaranteed that nothing would be adulterated between the time he made it and matured it and you drank it. So Bottled in Bond has a lot of that sort of what I call truth in labeling or sort of guarantees. And, of course, the government backed this particular law. It said that who made it, that they distilled it in one season, that they matured it in a warehouse for a minimum of 4 years, and then they bottled it at 50% alcohol by volume. The 100 proof point, the reason why it was significant is because it was the one that without really any sophisticated instruments, you could put it on gunpowder and strike it off and it would light. So that 100 proof point it was proof of the alcohol's character or content. So this was a way that people could, if they didn't trust the label, they could do some crude means and say, yeah, the alcohol content is there because it struck off of trying to light it. But if I think about what's kind of going on today, you've got a lot of people that are putting whiskeys out, or they're non-producer brands. So you don't always know where your liquids are coming from. They're being produced across many different years and many different distilleries, and people are being very successful with that. But I think at some point people kind of want to know, well, who made this and where did it come from, and what's the background on it. So being a manufacturer, as Jack Daniel's is, this allows us to kind of say, hey, we are the manufacturer. It's got our Tennessee DSP-1 designation on this, the first distiller in the state of Tennessee, first registered in the U.S. So this kind of gives you a little bit, deeper level knowledge of the product. It's a guarantee of character and quality, but also in today's cocktail culture. If you think about, there was a time frame where high proof on a whiskey was actually a deterrent to them being sold. I mean, people saw high proof and brown spirits as being harsh, and the 50s, 60s, and 70s were great for high proof brown spirits. Then the 80s, 90s, and 2000s were tough on them. So a lot of you saw the proofs begin to drop, and that was largely a survival mechanism because it made it more approachable for people who were struggling with the higher proof whiskeys. But today, the coin is flipped again. Now people are wanting the old brown spirits, higher proofs. All these are back in fashion, but cocktail culture has driven a lot of that. So bartenders are excited about whiskeys again. That's what's revived rye whiskey to a great degree too. You'll never hear a bartender say they want less proof from you. They'll always say the higher the proof, the better, because they see your product as one component of a cocktail. They have some intricate cocktails that they like to make, and by the time they have all the other ingredients balanced, they don't want the whiskey to have wilted. They need its character to still show up. So giving them 100 proof as a bottled in bond product, I think, is sort of a nice give to this community that in a way introduces your product to people. Very, very few people come out of the blocks drinking whiskey neat, I've learned. They need cocktails as an entryway into learning about whiskeys, and they'll ultimately choose the brands that they like based on probably, for us, maybe it's a Jack and Coke, maybe a Jack and Ginger, or a whiskey sour that somebody used making Jack Daniels, and it's like, okay, start dropping the mixers in it, let me just try the product by itself.
Now, realistically, almost all of the Jack Daniels expressions could be bottled in bond if they were bottled at 50% because of the way you guys manage your barrels, right?
Correct. The one thing that we have to, of course, we distill around the clock, and about 48 weeks of the year, we take about a 4-week shutdown, which is enough time for us to have a state-certified boiler inspector come in and make sure that what we generate steam with is going to be okay and it's going to last another year. But there's a sort of a mandated downtime that we have to take that ultimately is about 4 weeks of the year. But the rest of the season we're going, whether it's spring or fall, summer, winter, we kind of pass through other than this small time in September. So to make a bottled in bond product, the only thing that we have to do is make sure we don't cross over distillation seasons. So the law represents basically you have a spring distillation and you have a fall distillation. So it'll be like literally from January to end of June, and then from July the 1st to December. And normally we wouldn't necessarily have to worry about whether the barrels were on one side of that distillation season or not, as long as they were a minimum of 4 years. That's the American whiskey standard. So it does require us to make sure that when we're creating a batch, we're not a blended product, but we do put multiple barrels in batches, that we're just not crossing over that firewall that separates your spring from your fall distillation seasons.
And then bottle them at 50%, of course.
At 50%, yes. Which, of course, we manufacture everything for ourselves, and we do our own bottling, so that makes that piece much easier, that we don't lose the traceability and the certification of the product in our hands.
You mentioned this as sort of a gift to the cocktail community, but I got to ask the question. Most bartenders won't get to try this one because it's in travel retail only, right?
I think sometimes when you come out with a product like this, it's nice to kind of put it into a channel where you get really good sales data, and it allows you to figure out who does the product appeal to and who's going to buy it. Global travel retail provides us often the opportunity to say, is this product going to cannibalize another product that we put out, or will it be a new customer, Will the people be buying this and some other Jack Daniels product, or will they be buying wine in this product? That's always good to know when you're going to introduce a new product, and especially if you could see, consider that the product could become a long-term member of the portfolio. So I clearly think with bottled in bond, there've been other products that we've put out that went to global travel retail that were exclusives that I would have said we probably will always make it a travel exclusive. But with bottled in bond, clearly there's too much significance, there's too much pull for products like this in the domestic market, especially on premise and in bars and restaurants. So I feel like this is one of those things that we'll assess going forward. There's no imminent plan to make this product available locally in the local market, but I think at some point it'll have to happen.
And it would be a logical extension for the brand, given everything that you've done over the last decade since you became Master Distiller.
Well, if I look at the trajectory that I think bottled in bond might be on, we did a very similar thing with our Sinatra Select. When we first launched it, we went with a global travel retail exclusive on it that lasted for about a year. So during 2012, you could buy it in airports, but you didn't see it much of anywhere else. But in 2013, you began to see it begun to trickle out into some, especially the better whiskey shops, the one that tend to cover the full line, that always want the special things, where what I call the whiskey geeks out there who are always looking for the rare bottles and have a store in town that maybe caters to that and then looks for all the rare things. You wanted to make sure that you had the product in those locations for sure, for people who are willing to, to drive to find something special. So I think definitely bottled in bond could be a domestic product for us, and hopefully we won't wait too long. We won't frustrate people while they wait to get that.
As I noted, it's been almost a decade now since you became Master Distiller, taking over for Jimmy Bedford. You've been real busy since then, haven't you?
You know, we have. When I became Master Distiller back in 2008, we had 3 items in our portfolio, and today we have 10, and that 10 will not include the bottled and bond that we're talking about today. But if you think about it, I was kind of looking at, you know, how have we added to the portfolio and what products did that? You know, we did 2 flavors. That we found that that brings new consumers to Jack Daniel's and also creates new occasions. There's a lot of people view a flavored product as being different, so it's more dessert-like, especially our honey. A lot of people say it's my after-dinner drink, where Jack Daniel's never really was before. I used the honey there. So we did 2 flavors. We did 2 that were barrel-driven. You know, we're not just a whiskey maker, but we also make barrels at Jack Daniel's. So doing the toasted and charred oak barrel that was also grooved for the Sinatra. Became sort of the centerpiece of that product, and then go in and making a maple barrel that we toasted and used as a finishing barrel for the number 27 Gold. So we did 2 flavors, we did 2 barrel type extensions, and then we did 2 that are just based on new grain bill. So coming out with our first rye recipe since Prohibition, a 70% rye product, a single barrel version of that, but also what I would call the core or the black label counterpart. That's meant to be more of the workhorse of the rye from Jack Daniel's. That makes 6 of the new extensions. The other one was just a pure proof play. You know, people always want to know, what does your product taste like coming directly out of the barrel? What would that be? And I call it the distiller's privilege. I could just go up in a warehouse with a drill and find a barrel I liked and stick it in there and catch it in a glass and drink it. But most people never got that opportunity. But putting that into a bottle and allowing people who may never get a chance to walk up in a warehouse with me a chance to experience the product in its purest form. I'm a huge fan of the barrel proof. It was something that I had talked with our brand team for several years about before we collectively agreed that now was the time and we really needed to do it. So that would make out the 10 that we make today. That would be in addition to our Old Number 7 Black Label brand, our Double Mellow Gentleman Jack, and of course our original Single Barrel Select, the 94 proof single barrel that we offer in the U.S.
And the Green Label too, right?
Well, Green Label often is a regional product. It tends to come and go, and so a lot of times I won't mention Green Label. It is a counterpart to Black Label. It was our original label color. Green Label, if you go back in our history, actually predates Black Label. It's always been a slightly less mature product. So when you look at it, the color is a little bit lighter than Black Label. It comes exclusively off of our ground floors, specific warehouses where we tend to lose proof in the barrel, where normally the composite of all of our barrels gain proof. This is it's indicative of a warehouse that tends to not be as humid and have a lot of temperature swings as ours does. We go in at 125, but our exit proof across all barrels usually is going to be around 127. So we're in Scotland. They lose proof year over year. We gain proof year over year, which hotter, drier climate here.
How much of the product development has been driven by you and your guys in the distillery compared to the marketing guys?
Well, I think it's always going to be, a sort of a balance there. I think if we were leaving it to the people at the distillery, you probably don't do flavors. And that's because a lot of the people who work at the distillery are already whiskey drinkers. We didn't necessarily see that as a market opportunity, but the success of Honey and Fire for us have told us that definitely there was a need out there that we probably wouldn't have explored had we not heard back from markets who say, hey, we need to do this. We've been talking to people, and it's a missed opportunity to not do it. When you come to a product like rye, we were given complete latitude on how the rye would come together. It's like, the rye category is moving up. It's time we need to start thinking about making a rye for Jack Daniel's. That was really the end of the conversation. It was a quick huddle at the distillery with people who had a lot of years of whiskey making experience, who knew the contributing character of the different grains and how changing that balance was going to change the character, and ultimately deciding not to do the 51% rye, not to do the 95% rye, which was the two most common things that you saw in the rye category at the time, but to go with 70%, which we felt like was a very interesting inflection point of character, where it would be bigger in rye, rye character than a 51, but not necessarily monolithic and rye only. So leaving the other grains in at a big enough percentage that they would matter. So I think, I feel like in tasting it and comparing it across the ryes that are in the market today, there's a lot of rye labels out there today. There's not many different liquids, just to put it, very plainly. But I like where we landed with that, and I do feel like if people have tried the 51 and said, well, it's really not that much different than my bourbon, maybe a little bit spicier, but, I'm just going to go back and drink bourbon. A lot of the people who stepped up to the 95 have felt like it's so peppery and so spicy that they almost recoil off of it, and they would say, I don't like rye. And I'm like, well, maybe you do. You just need to get to that right inflection point of character. So we felt like Jack Daniel's was maybe an opportunity to give one more data point, one more opportunity to evaluate rye whiskey as a category. Yeah.
Has the 10 years been everything you thought it would be when you took the job?
Everything and then some. I don't think I was pretty naive when I did not travel with Jimmy out on the road before he retired. I had seen him at some of the events that we did around Lynchburg. I had been sort of a right hand and a helper, doing things like the barbecue hosting and things of that nature. But definitely in 10 years, I think by the end of this year, I'll have visited 40 countries. I've been all over the U.S. I've stood before thousands of people. As a native Tennessean, maybe it isn't surprising that I would be a fan of Jack Daniel's. I think Jack Daniel's is probably one of the most iconic products that comes from my state where I was born. So, to feel an attachment to it maybe comes naturally to me. But, you go to Dubai, and, fairly dark market. They don't allow a lot of advertising, so it's difficult to kind of get people to know about your brand. A lot of it has to happen through word of mouth, through industry people who talk about you, but just person to person. But, to have a fairly early session in the day where they said, hey, we're going to have 500 bartenders show up here, well, I'm kind of like, yeah, right. Early day, 500 bartenders, they're going to be sleeping in. They poured drinks later than they thought they were going to last night. I don't think that many people will show up. But to come in and see standing room only, where it was more like 700 people showed up, when you see that, you realize that this brand is a rock star, and a lot of people love it. It's an honor to stand under the banner and to represent it. I hope that my tenure will be a successful one, not just for myself. I never would have come into this job wanting to fail or expecting to fail, but more importantly, for the next generation who will follow behind us. The brand's been around 152 years. We want it to survive another 152 years, and we want to leave the brand in better shape than we found it. So I think that's the mission that I've set out on, and I know having an assistant master distiller in Chris Fletcher, whose grandfather was a distiller before him, he said, if the whiskey quality starts to drop, Grandpa's going to let me know about it. So the people before us are watching, and the people that will come are counting on us. So you don't feel like this is a job just for your lifetime. It truly feels like you're a steward. And you're in for a generation, and you do the very best that you can with it, and hopefully it's going to be in good shape, and the Jack Daniel's brand will still be thriving when I decide to hang it up. When that will be, I have no idea, but I'm just in my early 50s right now. But I love I think the long-term prospects for Jack Daniel's. It's an exciting time to be in the American whiskey business. There's a lot of things going on right now, a lot of confusion, smoke and mirrors, and with a lot of brands coming in that I think ultimately that will settle, and you'll find that the whiskeys that have been around for a really long time have been around for a long time for a reason. So I don't think the craft distilling thing represents a massive threat to Jack Daniel's, because we have unique character and we have a very loyal following. We just need to make sure that we don't take our eye off the ball. We need to continue to make quality products that speak to people, and if anything, recruit in new drinkers. I think having a portfolio of 10 products has us better positioned to do that than when we just had 3.
Has Chris been sort of identified as your heir apparent?
That would be my intention. The day that I first contacted Chris and let him know that the role was going to post, he and I had worked together in a previous capacity. He worked in R&D, and I was the quality control manager of Jack Daniel's. I always was impressed with him. He's a smart guy, very professional, but humble. Loves the brand. Grew up in Lynchburg. Watched his grandfather be the distiller, the master distiller there as a child. So I felt like he had an appreciation for the role that it would just be hard to recruit or to build into anyone else. That was one of the benefits of Jack Daniel's having grown over the years, as we had gotten to that point where we really had enough work there that I feel like Chris is he's not just a competent right hand. Sometimes he is the only hand. I need time off, and he's a competent whiskey maker. He's everything I would want him to be, and at the end of the day, he's an authentic, real voice of Lynchburg to represent the brand. And he was happy to be able to move back home, build his long-term home on family ground. Is literally one hill over from his sister, with his parents right below him. And I think that if you'd asked Chris if he could have painted a better picture for himself, career-wise, would it be this or would it be something different? I think he would tell you that he feels like he's where he's supposed to be and where he'd always hoped he would be.
What's the craziest thing that ever happened to you on the road in the last 10 years?
Oh my gosh, that's an interesting one. Well, we were talking about Dubai earlier, and they gave everybody who attended the tasting session that day. We did sort of an educational tasting where there were samples. We literally poured thousands of glasses of whiskey on the table that day to support all these people who came. As soon as my session ended, I got rushed. I literally felt like I was Elvis up on stage having people come and attack me, but they had been given a photo card and they all wanted to get an autograph on it. And people kind of came up and started surrounding me, and they were throwing their cards over the top of one another, and you didn't know which one to sign. But the next thing you know, I couldn't breathe. I literally felt like I was getting crushed in it. So it was a little bit scary there for a moment. Eventually somebody kind of came in and cleared the area and backed it up and organized a line where people could get things signed. But I wasn't expecting it. Totally caught me off guard. So that was one of those moments that I kind of was like, what have I gotten myself into? I feel like I know how to make whiskey, but you're just not always ready for moments like that. But once again, it's such an honor to be the Master Distiller for Jack Daniel's. So those moments have been few and far between. There have been far more moments that are memorable and where I didn't want to run away screaming. It's been a great ride, and I have absolutely no regrets.
You'll find my tasting notes for the new Bottled in Bond Jack Daniel's in our last episode and at whiskycast.com. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Lagavulin, the legendary Islay single malt. Look for the classic 16-year-old Lagavulin, the Distillers Edition, and the throwback 8-year-old Lagavulin at a whiskey shop near you. Find out more at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill. And let's start off with the Jack Daniel's Single Barrel Select. This is not the barrel proof edition. It's bottled at 47% ABV, and the nose is nice and sweet with notes of caramel, honey, vanilla, and muted spices. The taste, though, is very spicy, with notes of black pepper, chili powder, and just a hint of ginger root. They fade slowly to reveal hints of caramel, vanilla, and honey. The finish, nice and long with gently fading spices and a good sweetness. I'm scoring the Jack Daniel's Single Barrel Select a 91. I received a sample of the Belle Meade Cask Strength Reserve Bourbon from Tennessee's Nelson's Greenbrier Distillery. Belle Meade is the Nelson Brothers label for their sourced whiskey, in this case, high rye bourbon from casks between 7 and 11 years old, and bottled at 59% ABV. The nose is oaky with honey, molasses, vanilla, caramel, and just a hint of spice. The taste has a good balance of spices and sweetness with chili powder and cayenne, balanced by honey and caramel notes, while the finish is medium length and slightly dry with lingering spices. I'm scoring the Belle Meade Cask Strength Reserve Bourbon an 89. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, our tasting notes are brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery, proud to announce the 2018 edition of Parker's Heritage Collection. This year's edition carries on Parker Beam's legacy of excellence and innovation with a unique bourbon finished in orange Curacao barrels that accent the bourbon's own natural hints of citrus. Once again, sales of this year's edition of the Parker's Heritage Collection will benefit the ALS Association. Find out more at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. A couple of weeks ago, I mentioned the new Buchanan's Select Blended Malt Scotch whiskey from Diageo and received a sample via the Whiskey Ferry. This one is a 15-year-old blended malt bottled at 40% ABV, and the nose has a surprising amount of peatiness, along with touches of red apples, peaches, and a nice maltiness. The taste is thick and rich with a good smokiness and notes of charred oak, honey, caramel, red apples, a hint of peach pie, and soft spices. The finish is long and gentle with a lingering smokiness. Now, I'd love to see more blended malts coming out of Scotland, and this one is a good one. I'm scoring Buchanan's Select a 92. Finally, we have to acknowledge that, yes, Heaven Hill does sponsor this segment, but I'm not about to ignore the new release of Heaven Hill's 27-year-old barrel-proof bourbon. We reported on this one in the news about a month ago, and it's just now getting out on the market. I received a sample on Friday. It comes from 41 of the remaining barrels of whiskey distilled at the Old Heaven Hill Springs Distillery in Bardstown before it was destroyed in that 1996 fire. It's bottled at 47.35% ABV, 94.7 proof, and the nose has notes of dried fruits, pipe tobacco, black cherries, and subtle hints of nutmeg, peppercorns, and clove. The taste is thick and chewy, and surprisingly for its age, not overly oaky. There are notes of dried flowers, vanilla, black pepper, clove, cocoa beans, and caramel candy to go along with the subtle touch of oak. The finish is long and sweet with hints of oak and pipe tobacco. I'm scoring the Heaven Hill 27-year-old barrel-proof bourbon a 93. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 2,250 different whiskeys from around the world at whiskycast.com.
This is whiskey. Johnny Walker's Scotch whiskey. From this place, and these places in that place. These are the people that make it. This is what they sound like.
Because you're a cheeky wee blighter.
Dance like. Aye, like that. This is what they do all day. Building the great character of Johnny Walker Black Label. Aging in oak for 12 long years.
Thanks. Oh, it's gorgeous there.
What is character? It's giving a damn.
You're alright, lassie.
Which looks like this, as much as this. See, the land that shapes these people and the people that shape this whiskey all shape how bloody good it tastes.
Put the bloody game on the telly, Alan.
A whiskey as bold as it is complex. For every step you take, this is Johnny Walker Black Label, friends. Step right up.
Cut.
Can I drink this now?
Johnny Walker Black Label Blended Scotch Whiskey, 40% alcohol by volume, imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Don't forget to check out the latest episode of our WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast. We gathered a panel of other podcasters together to taste rye whiskeys this time around. You can download it at whiskycast.com or wherever you get your podcasts. It's brought to you by the Whiskey Exchange. Let's open up the inbox now for your voice, presented by Lot 40. Last time around, Jimmy Russell and the late Parker Beam shared their opinions on what defines a master distiller with us on our Behind the Label segment. As you might expect, that led to a lot of reaction on social media, especially from people within the industry. Mark Vierthaler is the distiller at Boot Hill in Kansas, at Boozmonger on Twitter, and here's what he said. From a craft distilling standpoint, I can say a fair number of us whippersnappers hate using this term when it comes to mean head distiller. There's also rumbling on the craft side of working to develop some sort of certification vis-a-vis sommelier or cicerone. And by the way, a cicerone, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, is the equivalent of a sommelier for beers. Mark Schilling in Austin, Texas, is a former president of the American Craft Spirits Association. He tweeted this, I wince when I hear someone describe themselves as a master distiller, especially when they've been in the business for less than 5 years. Brian Tracy is the president of Sagamore Spirit Distillery in Baltimore. He tweeted, so many are quick to hand out that title to somebody on their team for marketing purposes. The term master distiller is practically ruined. Wes Henderson of Angel's Envy is the son of the late great Lincoln Henderson, another person who earned the title of Master Distiller the hard way. Wes's comment? Don't get me started. And Louise McGuane of Ireland's Chapelgate Whiskey Company is rarely short of opinions. She tweeted this: I would say 25 years of experience to earn the term master. It should be experience-based like in cooperages. Surely it comes with experience. Same goes for blending, in my humble opinion. And finally, iLaddie Whiskey Nerd added this thought on Twitter: what those rules would be, I would not know, but they would need to cover both hands-on and theoretical know-how and being able to educate. The rules would be a combination of factors that have to be 1, not 0. Just one factor of, let's say, 20 years in the field would not be enough by itself. Now, if you're following us on Twitter, we've posted a poll asking whether there should be a formal definition for the term master distiller. We'd love to get your vote and your views as well. If you have something else you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can also share that on Twitter, along with Facebook, Instagram, and Tumblr. And, of course, the Your Voice page at whiskycast.com. Your Voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's wrap things up now with Behind the Label, our look at the science, history, and other stuff that make whiskey unique. We have talked a lot in recent weeks about the tariffs on American-made whiskeys that the European Union, Canada, Mexico, China, and Turkey have imposed on American-made whiskeys over the last couple of months. Those tariffs are part of their retaliation against the tariffs on imported steel and aluminum that the U.S. government imposed on them. And it leads to an interesting question. Do those tariffs apply to the whiskeys sold in travel retail, the duty-free shops? I've been asking around, and the answer appears to be, in some cases, no. The reason is that those tariffs are applied when a shipment officially enters one of the countries imposing those tariffs by clearing customs. In most cases, whiskey sold in duty-free shops never actually clears customs when it enters a country, but remains in a duty-free warehouse at the airport until it goes on the shelf. And since it's only sold to passengers flying out from that airport, the tariff is never actually applied. Now, I said for the most part, and here's the exception. Remember when I mentioned that new Teeling whiskey for the Dublin and Cork airport shops back in the news? And I listed two prices, one for travelers flying within the European Union, and a lower price for those flying to non-EU destinations. Now, since the European Union does not have duty-free sales internally, this is one of those cases where duty-free is an accounting trick. The retailer tracks all of its duty-free sales separately from taxable sales, and its sales are audited to make sure that all of the proper taxes are being collected. In cases like this, the tariffs would be applied to imported American whiskeys, then deducted at the register as part of that lower so-called duty-free price that's charged to travelers flying outside the EU, while travelers inside Europe would pay the price with all taxes and the tariff. It's the reason you have to show your boarding pass when you're buying stuff at a travel retail shop in an airport, just to prove you're actually leaving the country. If you have something you'd like us to look at on Behind the Label, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. That's also where you'll find links for our WhiskyCast HD videos and the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast, the latest whiskey news, events, and much more, including a complete archive of all of our past episodes. The Cask Strength conversation continues online all week long. You'll find us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know no redbreast.
This is whiskey, Johnny Walker's Scotch whiskey, from this place and these people, aye, Scotch makers, creating the bold and complex flavour of Johnny Walker Black Label. Step right up.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2018, and comes to you twice a week from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.